evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You'll go ahead and open your Bible to John 7. Book of John, verse 7. I was thinking this morning during the lesson that almost every mention of Andrew on a personal level came from the Gospel of John. And I kind of wonder if there wasn't some sort of special relationship between the two. Again, my brain wonders and fun things sort of happen there. I really appreciate him doing that for us this morning. Took a little bit of the load off of me this week with us being out of town, and he was so willing and to do so. As soon as I saw him, and he said, "Hey, I moved to Birmingham." I said, "Dude, you want to preach that?" I love sitting at the feet of other people delivering the Word of God, and I really appreciate him being willing to do so. Before we get started, let me go ahead and make just a couple of announcements. One is regarding the singing this Saturday. We're going to do something a little bit different. I talked to the elders about this, but we've heard it over the last several months just how badly we miss singing together. And so that was something, Tiffany and I were talking about, opening up our driveway, and then we were concerned about, where would everybody park, if we all needed to sit out there. And she goes, "Well, why don't we just do it at the building?" So I thought that was an excellent idea. Once she convinced me it was an excellent idea. And I came to the elders, and the elders agreed that it was a good idea. They were concerned about the heat, which is why we're going to try to do it at 6 o'clock a little bit later than we normally get together. But we're hoping with the days getting shorter and the evenings getting cooler, that we can kind of space out a little bit and enjoy some time singing and worshiping God together. So we'd love to have you come, bring a comfortable chair to sit in, and we'd love to have you come sing with us on Saturday evening. That will be from 6 to 7:30, and just kind of making sure you know the details. Also, Steve and I have been talking all the details about the storytelling event coming up next month, last Saturday in September. We already have it on the calendar from 10 to 12 that morning. There will be other times where we have to get together to run through things, maybe that Wednesday night before or the Sunday afternoon before. But I do want to kind of give you an idea of where the progress is on that event as you work on your part of the event, if we're taking part. I've had several, Randy and Prairie send me scripts of what they plan to say, what they're working on. I would love for everybody to do that. I will read through it. Steve will read through it. We will offer any suggestions if we have any. We will also kind of help you see a framework of the way the set will be set up as soon as we get all that worked out in our heads, but we're still working on that. And that leads me to my announcement tonight, which is we have some ideas on how we're going to get this front of the auditorium set up for this event. But if you have building experience or design experience, I'd love to have a short meeting up front afterwards so that we can kind of walk through what we're planning, and you can help us see where the snags and difficulties are in what we're planning. We figure more heads are better than just our two, and if we can work together, we'll be able to get plowed through that. So if you've got building or design experience, we would love to have you come up front afterward and let's have a short little conversation about that. So, that being said, let's jump into our lesson for this evening, which we're going to continue our series on the one-on-one conversations that Jesus had with people through the gospel. And so we started this several, and again, we don't do this every week, but we started this a little bit over a month ago, talking about different one-on-one conversations that Jesus had and what we can learn from those conversations. And we've already covered the two disciples from Emmaus. We've talked about Mary and Martha, and tonight I want to talk about the adulterous woman, which is why we're going to start there at the end of chapter 7, which is really where the story begins. I'm going to read the story before I go on a little bit of a nerdy tangent before we actually get into the story. So that's just where we're going. But let's start here at the end of chapter 7 and verse 53, and we'll read down through chapter 8, verse 11. Then each one went to his house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he went to the temple again, and all the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. "Teacher," they said to him, "this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" They asked this to trap him in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, "The one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at him." Then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. When they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. Only he was left with the woman in the center. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she answered. "Neither do I condemn you," said Jesus. "Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore." Now, I have to go on a little bit of a nerdy tangent here, because if I don't, I'm going to have several of you come up to me afterwards and ask this question: why is this section in brackets in my Bible? I don't know, some of you probably noticed that, some of you probably didn't. And if you noticed in the brackets that some of your text will have a little footnote or a little note there that says the earliest MFS or manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. So this section is in brackets in our text because those who have translated our Bible are trying to be faithful to the text, and it is a general consensus that this text was not a part of what John originally wrote. It is there now. It is in so many manuscripts that they include it, but it was most likely not in John's original writing, what is called the autograph. It's probably just not there. And here's some of the reasons why. It's missing from all of the Greek manuscripts from before the 5th century. All of the earliest church fathers who talked about the Bible, none of them directly quoted anything from chapter 752 down to chapter 8, verse 11, which is kind of conspicuous because they quoted everything. So the fact that they did not quote this as a part of John's gospel is significant. The text actually flows pretty seamlessly from chapter 7, verse 52 down through chapter 8, verse 12. There Jesus is talking about proving his own self, proving who he is at the end of chapter 7, and then he moves into chapter 8, verse 12 with, "I am the light of the world." He's still talking about himself. And so there seems to be a more continual thought process if you leave this section out of the text. None of the Eastern church fathers cite this passage from before the 10th century. When the story started to appear in manuscript, it's interesting that it's placed in multiple different places. So even in the Gospel of John, it's placed after chapter 7, verse 36. Another manuscript has it after verse 24. Another manuscript has it at the very end of the book in chapter 21, verse 25 and following. One of the early manuscripts even includes this story in the Gospel of Luke. So it's not even in the Gospel of John. But you take all of this kind of evidence together, the style, the vocabulary is different in Greek than what you find in other texts in John. It just becomes unlikely that it was actually a part of the text. Probably not one of the stories that John includes in his Gospel. Why does all that matter? There's a field of study called textual criticism. It is an interesting field of study for any of y'all who decide you want to dig deeper and kind of plunge into the depth of Scripture and how we got Scripture and how we know Scripture is reliable and all those sorts of things. Textual criticism is important. For what it is basically basically the idea of just studying the text not for the message, but for the text itself. Why did they write this the way they wrote it? Why did they include these details and not these details? What do we know about the author? What do we know about who he was writing to? Those kinds of questions. Those are all part of textual criticism. And the reason textual criticism and asking questions about text like what we have here are important is because it allows us to dig a little deeper into the context. How many of you have heard preachers and Bible class teachers say context is important? Every hand better raised because you've heard me say it. I'm just saying, you've heard it without saying. Context is extremely important because context is key in figuring out what the meaning and the purpose of a writing is. And so you figure out what the context is, why is it said the way it is said, in the context that it's said, you can get a little deeper into the meaning, into the message itself. And textual criticism helps us figure out the context. This story is out of context, but a lot of the other stories in John have a very specific context. John is known for matching the miracle it shows Jesus did with the message that Jesus delivered. So he healed the eyes of the blind man. What that couples together with the concept of I am the light of the world. You see how that works together. He feeds the 5,000, and then he talks about I am the bread of life. And John was really good about matching together the stories with the teachings, and you've got a context there that builds on itself. This story is the exception to that rule. But that context has become very important in the way that we understand things. For years, I struggled with the miracle Jesus did where he halfway healed the blind man. Y'all remember that story? That story is understood only by the context. You have to dig into all the other stories in which that story is placed in order to understand why Jesus did that. And so context becomes important. It's all textual criticism also important because it helps us with our faith. It helps us to have more faith in the teachings of Scripture. For instance, you compare what we have in the Bible manuscript with what we have in other texts, and it is a stark contrast. There are 10 existent manuscripts of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. There are only 2 of Tacitus's histories and annals. There are only 8 of the history of Thucydides. All these names throw me off. Of the Iliad and the Odyssey, we actually have 1,000 manuscripts in existence, which is amazing. I found it interesting. The University of Chicago actually is quoted as saying over 1,000 manuscripts of Homer's works exist, far more than for any other ancient author, and many more of the Iliad than the Odyssey. He's wrong. Because there's one other ancient writing that we have more of, and it's this. Of the New Testament alone, we have over 5,800 manuscripts, ancient copies of this book. And why that's important is because it allows us to know with very clear assurance that what we have in this text is the true text. It also what lets us know that this story probably was not part of John's original writing. Because we can compare to all of these manuscripts together and get to the bottom of whether it should be there or not. Here's what's interesting about this text. It's still most likely that. Bruce Metzger, who is a biblical scholar, says the account has all the earmarks of historical veracity. Carson says there is little reason for doubting that the events here described occurred. And here's why I think it's important. This whole biblical textual criticism concept that some of you have not even listened to me for the last 5 minutes, and I keep using words like that. Okay? Here's why it's important. If this story is true, which we have no reason to doubt that it is true, the early Christians felt that it was an important enough story that it needed to be included in the writings that were passed around from person to person. Which makes me ask the question, what is so important about this story? What about this story made them say, this has to be in there? Because by all accounts, even though we're not sure where it fits in the writing, there are very few who would argue that it shouldn't be in the Scripture. Because it really is a story that seems to have happened. Well, let's dig into the story in context. For those of you who have tuned out all of the textual criticism stuff, now you can start listening again because we're getting back into the text. Okay? This story is important because it tells the story of a woman who broke the law. We know that. We can see that. She was caught doing that. So they bring the Pharisees, those who are wanting to test Jesus, bring this woman to Jesus because they want to test him. They want to be able to accuse him. They want to be able to compile together some evidence to use against Jesus. And I find that in and of itself interesting. Notice, they don't bring temptation to Jesus. You ever thought about that? You ever thought about how many religious leaders in our world today and in years past have fallen to the temptation of the flesh? It's given into them. Often in very public ways in which not only are their careers ruined because now they can no longer stand in a pulpit and address the people of God because of the lack of respect they now have, their families are ruined, and most importantly, their souls are put in jail. Why not bring that kind of thing to Jesus? Other than the fact that I've been thinking they weren't going to trip them up in that. They knew Jesus' character well enough to know they're not going to get him to fail in sin. It's just not going to happen. Not with this man, not with a man who's that perfect, who's that pure. So they bring a woman, and really it's not the woman that matters as much in this story as it is the conundrum, the problem. What is Jesus going to do? Is he going to defend the law, or is he going to defend this woman? Which again, I find interesting because that tells us something about the way they view Jesus. That means they understood that Jesus cared about the law. He cared that right things be taught. But they also knew that he cared about people. And he was a merciful and forgiving and compassionate man. And therefore, he would be torn between two very different conclusions. Should I defend the truth of the law, or should I defend the life of this woman? Do you see that? Doesn't that teach you something about who Jesus was? That they believed that's the ultimate question for him. Which one do I defend? And here again, part of what I found interesting, they claim that she had to be stoned. Now, I went back and looked, and I can't find that in Scripture. Maybe some of y'all are better versed in Old Testament law than I am. But I looked, and I found 13 laws, if you wrote them, for which the penalty was being stoned. Now, there are other laws that he wrote that have the penalty of death. We'll get to that in a moment. But stoning specifically was attached to, and here's the list, touching Mount Sinai while Moses was out receiving the Ten Commandments, an ox that had gored someone to death, the ox was to be stoned in that case. The dividing the Sabbath, offering a child in some sort of pagan worship ceremony, engaging and bringing back the dead, or necromancy, some sort of witchcraft in that form, proselytizing people to other faiths away from God, required being stoned, cursing God, idolatry, rebellion against parents. Kids, listen to that again. Rebelling against parents carried the penalty of stoning. My kids in particular, I want you to hear that. And then there's also the brides who were not virgins, who were found not to be virgins on their wedding night. Those women were to be stoned. If a man and a woman engaged in intercourse when both were consensual about the activity, they were both to be stoned. Rape, the rapist was supposed to be stoned, and homosexuals. That's it. Now notice in here, here's why I say that might not apply to the woman. We don't know the circumstances of this here. That's never actually told to us in the story. There in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, it says, if a man is discovered having sexual relations with another man's wife, both the man who has sex with a woman and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. And then Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10 says, if a man commits adultery with a married woman, if he commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. But here's the problem. We don't know the circumstances here. We can assume she's guilty, but at this point, we don't know. All we know is these men who have clearly no concern for justice, no concern for righteousness, no concern for law keeping, because they didn't bring the man with them before Jesus. All they brought was a woman. In my mind, I picture if she's been caught in the act, she has been drugged through the street, barely clad, thrown in the middle of a crowd, embarrassed in front of everybody, and accused publicly. She's been caught. We don't know the details. We don't know what her situation was. We don't know if it was a situation of rape. I don't trust these accusers to come with that information. Do you? They don't seem to be entirely honest with you. Was he married and she not? Was she a married woman? All of this makes a difference when it comes to the overall. Where was the man? And was this a recent deal? Has she been in jail for a while? Has she already been accused? Or what is the detail? We don't know any of the details. And so I say that because I want you to be careful that you don't just take these accusers' word for what they're doing. Because that makes all the difference as to why Jesus responds the way he responds. It could be that Jesus, in his knowledge, knew more about that situation than any of those accusers did. And it's very obvious that Jesus sees through the accusers because of the way he responds to them. And I think it's very obvious that Jesus understands there's something going on with this woman that is not deserving of punishment because of the way that he responds to her. What is very clear among all of the shadows of this accusation is this. These Pharisees are not crying for justice. They are not bringing this woman to Jesus because they believe he is truly the arbiter of righteousness or the judge of the law. They are bringing this woman to Jesus because they know they can present a problem to him that he won't have a good answer for. And I kind of wonder if there's not unspoken truths in this story of had Jesus laid down a harder mass judgment, that they would have started pulling out other evidence to try the opposite side of the case in front of the crowd. Isn't that exactly what happens in politics these days? You better believe politics in Israel and Jerusalem were just as ugly and bitter and vicious as what we see today. These men were not concerned about righteousness. They were not concerned about this woman. They were not concerned about her returning her soul to God. They were not even concerned about law keeping, or they would have brought the man with them. That's not what's going on. What we do have happen in this story is that Jesus defends the law. We know that in the answer Jesus gave, he did not violate the law. The reason we know that is because had he violated the law, what do you think the response of the Pharisees would have been? They would have had the evidence they were looking for. Had Jesus had the wrong response, they would have been able to use that against him. As someone who taught against the law, he doesn't do that. They can't do that. What you see here, though, is that Jesus seeks to defend the law. What I mean by that. Notice in this case, Jesus displays mercy. Mercy. Hold your place there in John chapter 8 and turn to a few other passages here. Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, verse 13. Matthew chapter 9, verse 13 says, "Go and learn what this means." Jesus again speaking to these same obstinate people. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but to call sinners. Over a page or two in your Bible, chapter 12, verse 2, Jesus said, when the Pharisees saw that his disciples kicking heads of grain on the Sabbath day, they said to him, "See, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And he said to them, "Haven't you read what David did when he and those who were with him were hungry? How he entered the house of God and they ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him or for those with him to eat, but only for the priests? Or haven't you read in the law that on Sabbath days the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Had you known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Jesus is teaching, even through this episode with the woman, what it means to be a person who truly understands what the law is about. The law was not about condemnation. It was about mercy. Turn with me to John 7, verse 23. John 7:23. Says, "If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses won't be broken. Are you angry at me because I made a man entirely well on the Sabbath? Stop judging according to outward appearances. Rather judge according to righteous judgment." Well, I think probably the story should have. If you're just going to insert it in the Gospel of John somewhere, insert it here. Would have done much better for us. But it's interesting to me that Jesus here, again, in the debates that were happening about the Sabbath, he points back to the purpose of the Sabbath. You know, the Sabbath in and of itself is all we are concerned about is law keeping. You can't keep the Sabbath. You just can't. The Sabbath contradicts itself because the priests have to do work on the Sabbath according to the way the Jews had defined it. Or if a man had an animal fall into a well, he was allowed to go get that animal out even though it was a massive amount of work. Or if a baby needs to be circumcised and it happens to be on the Sabbath day, they would do that. That was purpose was not God sitting up there with thunderbolts in his hand, ready to strike down any person who barely just fell slightly short of the law. I can get them all! I can kill them all! That's not our God. Our God is a God of mercy. A God who had designed something like the Sabbath for our benefit. He gave the law for their benefit. And they were using it incorrectly. What is it that Jesus himself said when he summed up the law? Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22, verse 35. One of them, an expert in the law, asked the question, "Teacher, which command in the law is the greatest?" You all know the answer to this, don't you? Jesus said to him, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." Listen to this next verse. "All the law and all the prophets depend on these two commands." Go back to these men who have taken a woman in a sinful situation, for sure, in an embarrassing situation, and drug her out into the streets, and whether she was physically exposed or not, she was emotionally and socially exposed, for sure. She was thrown in the street. She was figuratively branded with a bright scarlet A. She was told and publicly humiliated. Let me ask you, was there any love in those Pharisees when they did that? Were they doing that to return her soul to God? Were they doing that in order to bring about repentance? To bring about rightness and righteousness? Not at all. Galatians chapter 5, verse 14 says, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, love your neighbor as yourself." That's what Jesus does in this story. Is it not? These Pharisees bring this woman and humiliate her in front of an entire crowd of people, throw her down in the center of the crowd, and they expose her to the world, and Jesus leans down and quietly restores her dignity. He loves her. And he displays his love for her in the way that he treats her. And in doing so, he also returns her to righteousness and compels her to live in righteousness as she goes forward. Notice he does not say, "I don't condemn you, what you did wasn't wrong." That's not what he says. And notice he doesn't say, "I don't condemn you because what you've done is no worse than what these Pharisees have done." There's no comparing her with other sinners. What he says is, "I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. Go forward and stop living the way that you're living." He restores her dignity, while at the same time he shows her what it means to see the gift of forgiveness. She didn't get that from her religious leaders. She got it from her Lord. That brings me to this concept that we often, I think, mistakenly draw a contrast between grace and justice. We'll talk about grace as if it's the opposite of justice, as if it is the other end of an extreme, that grace is the idea, the way we often define it, if we get past unmerited favor, which doesn't mean anything to most of it, and we get back to it is a gift, a good gift you receive that you don't deserve, right? In other ways, that's our alternative definition of grace. It's that good thing. And justice is getting what you do deserve. Right? They're contrasted. Not for Jesus. Jesus doesn't contrast to Jesus, they go hand in hand. Because the way Jesus does this, and I call it God's grace, because Jesus is really extending God's grace. What Jesus does is he extends this gift that you don't deserve, and he says, you know what? Part of that gift is that you can be reunited with God. Isn't that what he says to this woman? Neither do I condemn you. I'm rejoining you to God. Now go forward and sin no more righteousness. And by receiving grace and restoration to God, which brings us to live in a righteous way, it brings about justice because the sin disappears. That's the way Jesus wants justice. Jesus doesn't want justice through the fiery flames of hell. Jesus wants justice through redemption. And through redemption, if sin can be dealt with and done away with and no longer a part of our life, then we can go to heaven justified. The way this is supposed to work. Jesus, in the way he treated this woman, treated her with justice according to the law. He didn't act lenient with her. He acknowledged the sin. He dealt with the sin. He restored her to a relationship and urged her to move forward with righteousness. Justified. What I love about this story is that this story is the gospel story between Jesus and an individual. That's what it is. This story is our story. Because we are adulteresses. We are thrown in the middle of the crowd at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus has to decide what to do with you and me. And he can either come down with a hard iron fist and condemn us, or he can gently compel us to move forward forgiven and righteous. And that's what Jesus does. That's what we should be doing with others, is it not? I mean, you really follow that pattern. It's a very similar pattern in the way we should be treating the world around us, the way we should be treating our brothers and sisters. That we should extend that same sort of grace, not like the Pharisees. We should be like Jesus, right? And so we extend that same gift of grace. We restore the relationship between us and that person. That's what we call fellowship. And then we together urge one another toward righteousness so that we can experience justice. Justification. All of that works together. The truth is, just like in the story, our job is not to be the stone caster. Amen. It's not our job. We were, or maybe still are, sinners. And all who are redeemed by the same gift of grace. And all of us find ourselves guilty before God until we have received that grace. And then once we have received that grace, we're to extend that grace to others. Isn't this the same time? But then there's this. I'm going to be over to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to do a whole lesson on this last point coming up soon, but I at least, because of the context of the lesson, want to at least approach it here. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I'll read verses 9 down through verse 12. I wrote to you in a letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I do not mean the immoral people and is sexually immoral, or greedy, an idolater, or verbally abusive, a drunkard, or a swindler. You're not even equal to each other. For what business is it of mine to judge outsiders? Don't you judge those who are inside? God judges outside. Remove the evil person from the mind. Here's the other side of the same coin. While I 100% agree that we should be following the exact same pattern that Jesus used with this woman found in adultery, that he extended her this gift of forgiveness, and because of that gift, he restored that relationship. He kind of prompted her to move forward with righteousness, and through that she finds justice. There's the same side of that coin for Christians is that we also have a job to hold each other to the high calling that God has called us to. I don't want you to misinterpret when I'm teaching about Jesus and this adulterous woman as if that means we always have to bend down, right in the sand, and say, I don't condemn you either. First of all, not our place to condemn or accept. It's our place to help one another follow after Christ. My job in that relationship with my brother and sister is to help them be more righteous. Now, I don't necessarily need to do it the way the Pharisees did. Well, I find somebody in sin, and I drag them to the front of this auditorium, and I get up and I say, you won't believe what Matt has done. I'm not to be like the Pharisees. Shouldn't I, like Jesus did with this woman, have a one-on-one conversation and say, have you considered the law? Have you considered the way you are living, and is that the way you should be living? Shouldn't I be going to my brother and sister and saying, hey, I've noticed there's a problem in your life. How can I help you? How can I walk with you? How can I support you and encourage you as you grow and change and be more of what Christ has called you to be? Shouldn't I expect that from my brothers and sisters? If they truly love me, if they truly are concerned about my soul, should they be coming and saying, hey, Alan, we've noticed something recently. We need to talk. I hope we can. Because in the very next chapter, Paul tells us in verse 9, don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom? Do not be deceived. No sexually immoral person, no idolater or adulterer or male who have intercourse with males, and no thieves, no greedy people, no drunkards, no verbally abusive people, no swindlers will inherit God's kingdom. If I believe that, why would I help my brother if I see him struggling with greed? If I see him struggling with inappropriate thoughts? I see him glancing and staring at things he shouldn't be looking at. If I hear my brother or sister who are being entertained by sin, shouldn't I at least say, hey, walk me through this. Help me understand why you believe this is God-honoring. Not because we're accusing, not because we're condemning, not because we're throwing stones, but because we love him. The way these relationships are supposed to work. And I think sometimes we struggle with should we or should we not say something, or how do we approach these topics? You know what? I get frustrated when people say, you can't tell me that, you're judging me. I am judging. You know why? Because right there in chapter 5, Paul tells me to judge my brother or sister because I want them to go to heaven. Yeah, I'm judging. But I'm not condemning. I am making a judgment call that you need help, and I'm deciding that I need to be that person to help you. Nothing wrong with that. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, whether this is the same person called in sin in chapter 1 Corinthians chapter 5 or not, it's interesting to me that this is the way it talks about it here. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 5, if anyone has caused pain, he has caused pain not so much to me, but to some degree, not to exaggerate, to all of you. The punishment by the majority is sufficient for that person. As a result, you should instead forgive and comfort. Otherwise, he may be overwhelmed by excessive grief. Therefore, I urge you to reaffirm your love to him. Here's what I noticed in this passage. Is that when we are in the family of God, we have a responsibility to love each other. Sometimes that love requires us to have some hard conversations, some awkward conversations, maybe even some embarrassing conversations. Not by dragging them to the middle of a crowd and throwing them on the floor, not by publicly castigating or ridiculing them, not by talking ugly about them to other people, but by going to them and saying, hey, you need to talk. When we're willing to have that kind of openness and transparency, when we're willing to have those kind of conversations, you know what we do? We bring and prod people to heaven. And isn't that worth to do awkward conversation? I'm going to go ahead and be on record, because this is being videotaped and everything, and saying this. If you can tell me something that will help me go to heaven, I want you to tell me. If you can tell me something that is going to draw me closer to my Lord, I expect you to tell me. If you can share something with me that is going to cause me to join you in heaven singing praises to our God for all eternity, please don't hesitate. Please don't worry about what I will think. Please don't worry that I will get mad at you. If you come to me as my sister or as my brother and you tell me how I can live better, please do. Because I guarantee you I'm going to do that for you. You going to heaven is more important than your feelings. You going to heaven is more important than our relationship. You going to heaven is more important than your sin. More important than anything. We should never be like the Pharisees who drag a woman from sin to humiliation. But boy, shouldn't we all be like Andrew that we heard about this morning? We'll pay attention to the small things, and we'll bring people to Jesus, and we'll show people the Messiah. Shouldn't we be like Jesus here? Who will gently, calmly, lovingly, compassionately point people in the right direction. Absolutely. These relationships of that depth, of that quality, they're difficult. Now, I'm going to tell you, the reason I think they're so difficult is because they're so rare. Not many of us have experienced the kind of relationship where we can get away with having that kind of conversation with somebody. I don't have many of those people. And I hope we'll grow those relationships. I hope that means I've got a whole bunch of people spread out in this building right now, nicely socially distancing from one another, who will come to me, times get tough, and they will say, hey, bud, we need to talk. I hope I have the kind of relationship where you will do that about something you're struggling with. I hope you'll do that when you see me struggling with something. Because if we have that, we have so much more help and hope in getting to heaven. It's so much more help in pleasing and glorifying our God. And isn't that what it's really all about? So let me tell you right now, because I don't know what's going through your head right now, and I can only read the upper portion of most of your faces right now, so I don't know what you're thinking, except to say, or I always know what they were thinking, because her eyes tell everything. But, you know, it's one of those weeks. I don't know where you're at right now. If you're at a spot where you're struggling with being depressed, disheartened, down, I hope you'll come forward and ask for prayers, and I guarantee there'll be people here who can help you do that. And I don't know if maybe some of you are struggling with a sin you just have not been able to overcome. You find yourself falling back into a trap again and again and again. I hope you'll come forward. Because I guarantee you, we have people who will walk with you daily and help you through that. I don't know if your struggle might just be you just don't know enough. You don't know what you need to know in order to become a Christian. Come forward. We'll help you with that. We'll study with you all night, day after day after day, until you've made the decision to make Jesus your Lord. I don't know if there's some of you who have thought about it, who have considered it, and who are ready. But if you're there, we want to baptize you. We want to rejoice with you. We want to walk with you daily for the rest of your life, so that you can serve the Lord faithfully from now on. I don't know where you're at, but I do know this. No matter where you're at, I know where you need to go to. And that's Jesus. So if you need the invitation to get your life right, to straighten something out, to get things going the right way, tonight's a good night to do it. Tonight's the best night to do it, because it's easy. And I hope we'll do something about it tonight. If you need the invitation to get your life right, please come forward and let us know how we can help you.